What I've asked Lisa to talk about is sustaining independent alternative media and how we can work together to maintain these organizations. So, Lisa.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I have two little UDC stories myself. I spend a lot of time trying to get myself invited to conferences so that I can talk about the work we're doing. And very rarely do I hear back, except sometimes to be rejected. This was the first conference that invited me, and I'm so happy to be here, mostly because it gives me a chance to meet people like you all, to see this new environment, and to have a break from my job for a couple of days. My next UDC story is that when I arrived to the hotel, I saw this lying there, you know, with all the other freebie papers, and I couldn't help but notice it said zombie newspapers, and so I took a look at this amazing story. Die, zombie newspapers die. It's an amazing story, and I thought, wow, this is almost my speech. And I was reading it, and then it says Dr. Michael Nyman, and he's the co-director of this event. So I'm so pleased to be here among people who are sort of thinking along the same lines as I am. It's not all of my speech, so I'm happy to give you the second half of what I think this is about. When I was thinking of what I should call the speech, I thought, dismantle the left press. And then I thought, dismantle the left establishment. and then I thought, no, just calm down. Let's start first things first. So I'm not a professor, so I'm going to rely a little bit on my notes, and hope I'll keep your attention, and I'll be over soon, and then we can talk, and you can ask me any questions. So, I was surprised to be asked to speak here today on how we can sustain independent alternative media, because that's usually a question directed at George Soros or Steve Ballmer's or Arianna Huffington. It certainly is the $64,000 question for us laboring in independent, commercial, traditional, alternative, non-sectarian, democratic, Republican, vegetarian media today. The question of, bluntly put, where is the money, comes as media is going through a profound shakeup, with readers appearing to vote with their feet, and media practitioners guiltily wondering if it's something they did, not quite ready to believe our hard work exposing the ills of society is not what our audience wants to hear. Don't we have a product that's competitive with Facebook, Twitter, or, God forbid, AOL? This nagging question, how do we sustain independent alternative media, leads to thinking that perhaps we need new paths to income, that we need to sell something we didn't sell before, something that we didn't even know was there to sell, or that anyone wanted to buy. What the devil is in those ads along the sides of the webpage anyway? Those who have journalism in their bones have been told that we must come up with matches, stories with products. Or forget about the stories, just write about the products. Travel industry stories, big pharma, haircuts, or just write about yourself and your friends. It's like the path taken by Wall Street high flyers. If ordinary buying and selling is not reaping spectacular rewards, then invent something new and outrageous. Derivatives, subprime mortgages. Before I tackle the $64,000 question, I'd like to say something about the non-traditional news services I work with. Interpress Service and Global Information Network are two nonprofits, 45 and 25 years old respectively. The Rome-based Interpress, or IPS, was launched with support from UNESCO and donor countries in Europe who wanted to address the imbalance in news flows at that time, mostly north to south, very little south to north or south to south. In a study commissioned by IPS for the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications, it found that more than 3/4 of the news carried on the two IPS networks, English and Spanish, had its source in the developing nations and dealt with topics and people relevant to them. Global Information Network, a US-based nonprofit, relies on sales of news to over 200 minority and ethnic newspapers. That's African American, African, Caribbean, and Latino, and to commercial information services, and from income derived from our new public forum series on African issues. From the start, IPS journalists from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and other developing regions were thrilled to be writing stories based not on Western geopolitical perspectives, but on newsworthy events critical to people in the global South. IPS became the 4th largest news service in the world in a matter of years, churning out 15 to 20 stories daily on such key issues as the environment, gender, civil society movements, labor, and migration, to name a few. Newspapers throughout Latin America, Europe, and Asia were eager to run these stories by reporters from the regions on topics that were meaningful to their readers. In the US, IPS was sold as a tip sheet. Its stories rarely published on their own, but as a cheap idea bank for such mainstream papers as the Times, Newsday, and others. When I arrived as a part-time editor in 1985, the IPS novelty had just about run out of gas. Few unique third world stories appealed to the Times, except for the ones they dug up themselves. Then a perfect storm of events. Mandela was released from jail, and the freedom struggle in South Africa took a great leap forward, and IPS had the story written by an African from an African perspective. The river of stories that followed caught the attention of the Trade Association of the Black Press, the NNPA, National Newspaper Publishers Association, and the Louis Farrakhan paper, The Final Call. Farrakhan was a firebrand, and other black publishers kept close tabs on his fiery speeches and the extensive international coverage between the covers of The Final Call. Many new subscriptions followed, and pretty soon Global Info was supplying dozens of black papers with IPS news from Africa, the Middle East, Cuba, and other regions with people of color. While it's to be expected that corporate media has no appetite for stories critical of US corporate misbehavior, it was more than a little discouraging to find that our coverage of Africa and other third world global stories failed to meet the high bar of alternative, left of center, old left newspapers and magazines. Our stories were either too long, too short, too foreign, not timely, not US centered enough, or not left leaning enough. But for weekly black papers nationwide, the stories worked extremely well. This mysterious divide prompted a closer look at two parallel media worlds: the progressive white left press and the iconoclastic historic defender of civil rights for people of color, the black press. Somewhere between these two parallel worlds is the solution to the sustainability of independent media. The more I study these two media groups, the more I am convinced of a fatal myopia among the media moguls of the left. Our most notable left publications in these times, The Progressive, Alternate, Mother Jones, The Free Press, are nonprofits with cushions of family or foundation funding that allow them not only to produce magazines, websites, or lead think tanks, but to set agendas, as in the Media Consortium, a self-described network of the country's leading independent media outlets, if by that you want to exclude minority radio, newspapers, and websites. The Free Press is another depressing example. In 2005, according to the consortium's website, 24 leaders of independent print, radio, television, and online media came together to discuss independent media and the future of democracy. It was the first time in at least a decade that independent media producers and distributors came together to plan how to strengthen our effectiveness. End quote. Great idea. But the myopia of the nonprofit left has done worse than simply create a clubby group of self-described leading media outlets. They've created a body that excludes major leaders of black media, its publishers and editors. And until this past year, even the executive director of the Black Press Trade Association, Publishers Association, Hazel Trice Edney, was not an invited guest or member of the organizing committee of the National Conference on Media Reform, despite representing over 15 million readers. When the institution of the Black Press is 181 years old, and the Black Press Publishers Trade Group 68 years old, with over 220 member papers, how does it come to pass that its work is unwelcome into the folds of alternative independent media? And where are the publishers of independent Hispanic media, immigrant media, Arab media? I believe there is a wall of classism, racism, white privilege. The so-called left press has co-opted the terms of independent and alternative to maintain their singular hold on the dwindling number of foundations or handful of family fortunes, while ethnic and minority media struggle to get an ad. With a divided independent media, we are too few to sufficiently disseminate the critical news and information to empower and educate ordinary citizens, while right-wing ideologues raise a war chest of billions to regain power. We are too few to address the problem of rising operating costs, falling ad revenues, or the fickle funding policies of grant makers. Our balkanized left media continues to aim at the same white left readership, often carrying the same stories. How many left publications this week ran the same pieces? Closing Guantanamo, the weaponizing of North Korea, Somali pirates, Colin Powell, Iran, and all the while holding fiercely to its proprietary donor base and exclusive collection of funding officers. There is a solution to be found for the sustainability of independent and alternative media, but only when it breaks down these walls of imagined power, when it truly solves its collective problems collectively, when it can share resources, and when new faces and perspectives are truly welcome to build relationships, strategize, and constructively work together to reinvent the independent media sphere. Now, I know that not everybody can see all the independent black press that I get to see because they're my subscribers, but I did bring some amazing papers from Michigan. This calls itself America's Most Progressive Community News Weekly. Great paper. This is a Hispanic paper from New Jersey, Banda Oriental. Great pieces of analysis here. It's a Uruguayan community. Here's the final call, but I think it's for sale here in Buffalo. The Madison Times. A lot of our papers that we deal with are 8-pagers, small papers. Caribbean Life, whose editor is from Guyana, and it's a great paper full of amazing international stories. This got chopped up in the mail, capital Q's. So I have, and of course, this is the oldest black paper in New York, at least, the Amsterdam News. And we have a permanent space on the second page of Africa News. And this week, the two stories were, a court case is postponed while fighting heats up, and it's about the case involving Ken Saro-Wiwa of Nigeria, whose family has sued Royal Dutch Shell, and they're in court, and the case was postponed, possibly to allow for some negotiations, but at the same time, the Nigerian government is burning down villages in the Niger Delta, and there's an all-out war going on there. I don't know how much that's been reported in mass media. The second piece that we have here this week is called A Pan-Africanist Dies and a Giant is Lost. We know almost nothing about the giants, the Pan-Africanist giants in Africa. And whenever I have a chance to highlight the thinker, the name, the work, I do, because we have many Americans out there, including readers of this paper, who are wondering who are the outstanding thinkers on the continent. There's so much misinformation. So this is a beautiful story about Dr. Tajuddin Abdul Rahim and all the different things that he was involved with. An amazing man. I didn't know about him until he died, and we need to correct that. So I brought that paper as well. And then I wanted to also put out a challenge to you people. This morning at Walgreens, there was a young woman behind the counter speaking Spanish. So I asked her if there was a Spanish newspaper in town, and she said no. And I asked her if there was a Hispanic radio, and she said no. So there's only the internet, which is really a mixed bag. So I challenge.
There is a Spanish radio station, 1120.
Okay. She said there was some little paper, but it wasn't in her neighborhood, and she rarely saw it. I just think that in the past we've spent a lot of time on different topics, maybe scholarly topics, but I think right now we need to get in the trenches, and we need to help communities put out newspapers or whatever they think will inform their communities. Maybe you're already doing that. It's my first day here, I apologize, but I'm going to be finding that out, and hopefully we'll do something together. So I guess I'm open to questions. Go ahead.
I'm curious about this critique that you're making, and I think in many ways it's very valid. I'm wondering from what you've seen of the sort of white progressive left media movement, what could people within that movement be doing differently specifically? I mean, if you can just kind of expand on your comments of, is this wall that you're talking about something that is that can be dismantled in some way?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah. There's the National Conference of Media Reform. So a lot of money was raised for these annual conferences. So if there is money for us to sit down at the table together, let's really have an open meeting with representatives from ethnic and minority communities, and not exclude them. My neighbor, my colleague neighbor where I work, is the head of the Independent Press Association, which represents in our small area hundreds of ethnic and minority publications. They're never invited, to lead a table, at these conferences. So these are the kind of things, if you're invited to a conference and you don't see that the NNPA and its editors and directors have tables there, ask where it is. I mean, I asked a lot of people after that conference, and they didn't know, so we have to ask and demand.
First of all, hi, Danny Schechter. I'll be speaking later, but I just want to say something about Lisa's work. It's extremely essential and important, and one of the weaknesses, I think, in progressive media and teaching about media is a lack of giving respect to and promoting resources that are out there that are struggling to exist, that students particularly would find helpful and interesting if they knew about it. And instead of just critiquing the New York Times for the umpteenth time, perhaps we need to look more favorably and positively towards a lot of the independent media that's taking place in this country and that goes sort of ignored. In other words, what I find, and I think this is also true in the blogosphere, where I write a blog every day, the focus on issues seems to mirror whatever Fox News or MSNBC are talking about. The same sort of partisan slugfest, bashing Bill Riley one more time, focusing on issues that really don't expand people's awareness. It sort of promotes an attitude of contempt on the part of students, but not real information, not really a sense that there are other more important things to talk about and deal with. And I think that the work that Lisa Vives has been doing all these years, often alone, often without any funding support of significance, is extremely important in building these kinds of bridges that would make conferences like this, for example, perhaps more diverse racially and ethnically in the future than they are today. So in a sense, we do live in separated, I would say, separated cultures. And I think we need to find bridges. And I think that the work that she's doing is very important. And I think if we found a means of collaborating, we could potentially create media products that would have broader appeal and broader audiences than they do right now. So in that respect, I would like to pay tribute to your work and also encourage people to, as a takeaway from this conference, to take seriously their websites and their work and incorporate it in your curriculums to try to interest people in all this. Just one note about this, and I'll stop because I'm speaking later, and once I get going, it's hard to shut me up. But we created MediaChannel.org 10 years ago with the goal of trying to be a sort of one-stop shopping, at least an introductory interface to the whole world of media. We invited all these organizations to affiliate so that we could also promote their work through a directory and through online exposure. And what we found was initial enthusiasm. Over 1,000 organizations signed up. But then basically, the idea was, well, what are they doing right? Let's do it ourselves. So we devolved into this sort of competing world of cottage industries and small entities competing as much with each other, not finding a way to promote the larger presence of independent media. And this is also true on the video side as well as on the print side. And I think this is something that we have to think about. How do we market, distribute, promote, create audiences for the values and issues that we consider important, as opposed to simply focusing our firepower on the same issues that are being debated in the mainstream media. So, this is a challenge in a way for myself as much as anybody else to think about it. It's only when you see work like this, you realize what's missing, in our media work. And so thank you for what you had to say. It's really important.
I want to tell you about one other project that we started. We have an internship program, so I work with a lot of young people, and that can also be discouraging. I see young people that don't know where you buy a newspaper. I have young students that don't have a radio at home and don't care to have one, and they say, why should I listen to the news when they want to give it to me? I can just, whenever I feel like, get the news. Anyway, because we found that, because of media in its imperfections, people rarely hear African voices. And all the stories about Africa now, the Darfur and Ken Saro-Wiwa, are mediated through white organizations. I don't condemn anybody trying to do good, but what happens is, after a while, we don't know that Africans have a voice, and we don't hear that special voice. So we started something called Africa Roundtable. And on a monthly basis, we have discussions where people who are in town or coming through or something like that, they're from Somalia. We had a great discussion on Sudan with a Sudanese professor, and we showed a movie that was made by a Sudanese woman journalist. We had an amazing event called, we screened a film called Blacks Without Borders, which was about African Americans moving to South Africa and thinking that they found paradise because they're wealthy there. And we showed that movie to a mixed audience, and there was such an amazing conversation. Yes, you can come here with a lot of money and you can buy a beautiful house, but what are our conditions like there? And you're sort of stepping on our bodies. Amazing discussions that came out. We've had, we had Dambisa Moyo, who wrote that book. We're also connected to a new group called Sahara Reporters, which is a Nigerian-led website that exposes the corruption in Nigeria, because media in Nigeria is either government-owned or censored. So this fellow who had gone through torture and everything else, so now he's here and he has this website that even the BBC is writing to him, how'd you get that? Or what about that? Or something like that. The most amazing, and he, because he's 20 years younger than me, he's using video, he's using, all these other things, and when you go to this site, you'll see interviews with people on video. You'll see people captured, leaving the country with suitcases of money in the palaces that they live in Europe. He's got all that plus stories, plus, they're doing Sahara TV. So we're trying also to be, an incubator for these new media projects that are coming mainly out of people frustrated with not getting to be at the table, getting in the door. So, okay, more questions? Dee Dee.
Yeah, two things. One, when you talk about the ethnic press, you didn't really mention any Asian ones, and I wonder about like the Korean press and the Filipino, etc. The other question is, in where I live in Woodstock, there's a paper that's put out in Kingston that's actually, it's attached to, it's funded, it's really an affiliation with the Kingston Daily Freeman, which is not a very progressive paper. And this paper is like amazing, the one that's in Spanish. They have all these very positive articles about, for example, the Cuban health situation, and I keep like wondering about it, and I finally met the editor and asked him, and he said how he could write such progressive articles, and he said, well, the owner of the Kingston Freeman doesn't speak Spanish, so he has no idea what. And I just wondered if there's other examples of that.
Well, a lot of major mass media, spun off a Hispanic version to try to capture this growing market, and usually they say, just translate our articles. So I have a friend who became an editor of one of them, and she had to quit because they didn't let her do any of her own reporting. And we would love to do Asia, but the IPS agency didn't carry enough to be able to do that. We carried more African stories. There is a lot of Asian, in India they have Press Trust International, which has like a gazillion stories every day, so it's hard to enter that market. Yeah?
There's no problem with media in general in the United States, because it's seen through the lens of the nexus of being in the United States, being in the sense of the empire, and that isn't Al Jazeera, which is changing that lens, in effect. I mean, most of the media, and I've been dealing with media for a long time, in America, it comes from an unconscious position that, I call it all roads lead to Rome, meaning saying everything is perceived in the American perspective, and that's very much for the left media as well as the conservative media. And you have this kind of other entities that are growing up internationally. Al Al Jazeera being the most successful model, which has 1 billion listeners, 1 billion people involved, is that shift, is that a critique? I mean, are you stepping outside of that box with your project? I mean, are you essentially seeing it from a different lens, basically? Because I mean, just like the struggles in Latin America, that you have the mainstream media in Venezuela constantly attacking Chavez, and then you have Chavez doing the same thing with Evo Morales, the same. Mexico also the same thing going on.
The international news that is carried by IPS, is produced by IPS, is reporters from Venezuela or from, the region, so they're definitely writing from their perspective. I don't share every single view they have. Sometimes I think, why are you criticizing Chavez? He's but, they are, and it's, I guess, worthwhile to read them.
So, one of the problems with Chavez is that...
What's that? I can't hear you.
I said one of the problems with Chavez is not a problem, but one of the things he's dealing with is the investment of large sums of money into the opposition by various institutes in the United States, Democratic Institute, Republican Institute, and they're filtering a great deal of that stuff into the mainstream media of Venezuela, which gets recycled back to the New York Times and other classic black CIA.
Yes, up there.
I just wanted to know where you are based personally, and if you can leave contact information for those of us who'd like to bring some of this stuff into the class.
Absolutely, you can come and get my card. We're in Midtown Manhattan, which is actually a neighborhood that's really, there's a lot of ferment, media ferment. We're across the street from Committee to Protect Journalists, from we're Women's E-News, the Independent Press Association, Human Rights, Madre, a lot of different organizations are right there. So we're there on 29th Street in a really great ethnic neighborhood. They just opened a new African restaurant 2 blocks from the office. You're welcome anytime to come, or, we can send stuff to you, whatever. What? Interns? We love interns. We love interns, yes.
But you can't pay them.
Not right now, but they will definitely. We get students from NYU, New York University, Livewire. They're writing great stuff. Nobody even, gives them a job. So we put their stuff in our system. It goes all over. They have great clips. They can, maybe they have to be a reporter outside the U.S. for a while, but they have great clips. It's picked up. You look up their names in Google search, and you'll see a lot of pickup of their good stories. So we help a lot of people who don't really write, who really don't write, and we work with them, and so they really get something for their time. Yes?
Could you address how you overcame the difficulty of monetizing your content in a world where people are used to free content on the internet?
Well, we have an extraordinary case because when I started, there was a lot of commercial information services who were buying information for the corporate sector. So you had LexisNexis, you had Dow Jones Factiva, you had some that bundled up news for schools, ProQuest, Data Times, a lot of them. We still have some of those contracts. The money is, not what it was. It sort of hit a nice point, 5 or 6 years ago or more, and it's just been dribbling down. So we had one grant from MacArthur some years back when Danny and I were both they gathered all of us small people in a room to say thank you, for your good work. Now we give all our money to NPR. So we haven't gotten a grant since then, but we did get something from the Ford Foundation for Sahara reporters, capacity building for this Nigerian citizen journalism thing. And it's a wonderful thing. But I'm not gifted in the art of monetizing. I wish I was, but so far I have 10 heads and I don't really have, space for that other head. But, I'm thinking about it day and night. When I go to bed, I think about it and try to do something. A lot of the small papers that we work with, they can pay a little bit or they can't pay anything, and we still supply them. Question?
Actually, I just have a programming note. I know we're running short on time. For some examples of local alternative media, you guys might want to check out this one programming change In DC North 2C, at the 12:15 and then at the 2:45 slot, we're going to be showing some local independent films. We'll be running those throughout. A number of them kind of touch on topics like this. I know in the 2 o'clock session, we're going to be showing Meg Knowles, Growing Green in Buffalo, New York, Prisoners Are People Too, and We Are the City among the titles there. So keep that in mind, 12:15 and 2:45. That's DC North 2C.
More questions? Anybody want to tell their story of how they monetized their product or didn't? Is there a question? Am I missing a hand? Oh, hand.
Thank you so much for talking to us today. I just have sort of 2 questions. The first one is you mentioned the sort of giant post-colonial figures that are, I guess, until you said it, when you think about it, they're dying. And so are you witnessing a gap between that transfer of knowledge to the next generation and the people that you need to be able to provide your content?
No, I mean, there's new people coming up. I mean, it's different. And I'm a dinosaur, you know, I'm on the way out. But there are new people, you know, who are gathering different kinds of information. And, you know, it's not the narrative that I grew up on, but, you know, hopefully it'll serve them. So, you know, I'm just sorry I missed meeting all these people. You know, I mean, when you read this guy's life story, this one here, anyway, you'll read it here. He did amazing things, and other people knew him. I didn't even know him, but, you know, bad on me. You know.
The second part of that is, when you talk about monetizing your content, do agencies or do newspapers pay for the individual stories, or do they pay for the new service? Because I was thinking there's a whole bunch of small local papers that are looking for some novel content and the same buying as everybody in the economy, trying to have a different take so that they can get readership. So instead of just the left press,
We tell the small papers, if they have money, we like to ask $150 a month, and then they can have unlimited pick from our stories for their weekly papers. So every week they can come in, take as much as they want to use. Or if they're monthlies, you know, 70.
150?
What daily? Is there a daily, an alternative daily?
No,
Or a mainstream
I
daily?
guess my question is linked to another hypothesis that it doesn't have to be an alternative daily. It could just be
My experience with the dailies is that they have connections to AP, they subscribe or some other thing, and they're not going to spend another dime, you know, on anything. Or if they're even interested, I wouldn't, you know, poo-poo a deal if they wanted to do a deal with me. I'd come up with something. You know, everything helps.
right. But I mean, I guess their economic situation might lead them to 150 is cheaper than
Actually, you know, some of the big services are trying to get down, you know, to my level. So, yeah. Yes.
Okay,
Oh.
we're on time. But you've met Lisa, and I'm sure she's going to be around for the whole conference. And